Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining for this conversation with the artist Pia Camil. My name is Robert Wiesenberger. I'm the Associate Curator for Contemporary Projects at the Clark. And this program is in conjunction with an exhibition at the Clark by Pia Camil titled Velo Revelo, which is on view until January 3rd. I'm very happy to be joined in this conversation by Mari Rodríguez Binnie, who is Assistant Professor of Art History at Williams College, and who specializes in modern and contemporary art in Latin America. By way of introduction to Pia Camil, she lives and works in Mexico City. She's actually joining us from there today and installing a show as we speak at the Museo Tamayo, a group show in which she appears. And it's been a big year for Pia. So far, and in no particular order, she was the subject of a solo show at the Queen's Museum, in which her massive fabric installation transformed the museum's ground floor. She mounted a large-scale performance in the rotunda of the Guggenheim Museum, replete with a children's choir, and made a participatory fabric artwork that the museum acquired for its collection. And she's shown her extraordinary, and to me at least unexpected, figurative drawings in watercolor, acrylic, and oil stick at the Omar Gallery in Mexico City in a solo exhibition titled Laugh Now, Cry Later. Wonderful title. And she executed a small but beautiful show at the Clark titled Velo Revelo, which is the Spanish for the words veil and to reveal. The exhibition includes two large-scale garment-like fabric works that blend the language of geometric abstraction with indigenous dress, like the poncho or sarape. Pia is riffing here on Frank Stella, if you've seen the show specifically, and playfully subverting the so-called invention of post-war abstract painting and its claims to autonomy in favor of craft and the everyday. The title artwork of the show is a new site-specific work in the Clark's Manton Reading Room. It's a 30-foot curtain made of pantyhose, which is the first time Pia has used this material, and certainly the first time the Clark has exhibited anything in this material. And Pia is more than creating an object or even installation. It's a response to the space, which is itself, for those who have visited, you know it's a formal, public, institutional space, and she's created an installation that evokes intimacy, domesticity, and femininity, along with a multitude of associations to skin color, identity, and self-presentation. There's also a small surprise tucked behind the curtain itself, but I'll leave that to visitors to see or for Pia to mention. A word about the format for today. Pia will start with a presentation. Mari will lead a conversation after that, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So for questions, you can find at the bottom of your screen a chat. You can type anything in now or later, say hello or offer a question. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And thank you again so much for joining. And with that, I want to let Pia take it away.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be joining you in this call. And I'm going to show you a few slides of past and recent work that are somewhat related to the pieces I'm showing at the Clark. So this is a piece I did in 2009. It's called Pia Camil for Sale. And it's possibly the first time I engage with the ideas of commerce through a feminist perspective. And so I am strapped to the building with this pink cape, and I performed a series of songs that were scripted with a friend of mine, and the obvious associations of, you know, having me be the center of the work, and this brought pretty a big statement of putting myself in the market. Oops, one back. This is a series of works I was doing by photographing abandoned houses in the suburbs of Mexico City that were first picture format and then included in a portfolio, and then made into paintings, and obviously the references to modernist painting and how unfinished walls could be the potential sort of subject of those paintings, and obviously a criticism to modernism itself. These are my works from the Spectacular series, which were pretty much one-to-one scale appropriations of abandoned billboards in Mexico City. So the picture on the right is the abandoned building. And so what you see is a shuffle of fragments of numbers, which obviously used to be the number that you dialed to rent the space. And so I was doing large-scale textiles, and the word espectacular in Spanish is the name for billboards. So there was an obvious play of words there with Guy Debord's idea of the society of the spectacle and its relationship to consumer culture. This is a script I did for this particular show, which was first show I did in a domestic setting, and the script was about these invisible women that habitated the space, which was dressed with the spectacular curtains and some vases that were shapes extracted from the curtains. And so it was just a way to sort of engage in the narratives of the sort of the byproducts of consumerism and its relation to the abandoned billboards. And then here we get into the Skeins series, which is the same series where I did the tunics that are on view at the Clark right now. And so on the top right corner, you see the original copper series paintings by Frank Stella, and then on the center is my own interpretation, which is basically a one-to-one scale copy of Stella's works, but done with slat paneling, and then I would insert a few accessories, like you see the copper shelf at the bottom, and then we see a reference of a particular store in downtown Mexico City of how this slat paneling is used in commerce. Then I did a few masks in ceramics that were also sort of remakes from the display busts used to display jewelry. And then finally the tunics, which are also sort of obviously copying the shapes of Stella, but in cloth, and they were first displayed in a museum in Cincinnati. And, you know, the public was encouraged to wear them and walk around the space with these tunics. And then a couple of projects I did with the idea of sort of putting the art market on its head. And then this is a project I did for Frieze in New York, where I gave away for free 800 ponchos, and people could just line up and wear them and take them home. A project I did for the new museum lobby, where I was asking people to bring a specific object that they that was important for them, and in exchange we would give them a contract in the form of a sweatshirt, and then we displayed their objects on a grid, and then in this way we generated a exchange economy by having people bring in an object in exchange for another object. So it worked a little bit like a shop for the duration of the show. And then this gets me into the series of secondhand t-shirts that I've been working on for the past few years. I wanted to show a reference of the street market in Mexico, which we called Las Pacas, just so that you get a sense of the sort of the density of these areas and the amount of clothes that are brought in, mostly illegally through the US-Mexico border, to be sold in this type of setting. First t-shirt work I did was a curtain for a show in Museum Ludwig, and it was the show was supposed to be shown in domestic settings. So we were allocated different houses across Cologne. And I just did a remake of Mies van der Rohe's Red Curtain of the Barcelona Pavilion, but with these merchandise, the secondhand t-shirts that I had bought in the market. I did a performance later with those works in the spirit of Ligia Pape's Divisor of the 1960s, but with sort of, instead of using the white sheet, I decided to use t-shirts instead. And we did this in the back, you see Ligia Pape's original work, and we did a performance in the center of Guatemala right when Trump was first elected 4 years ago. And then another format on this show is called Bara Bara Bara, which is the cry that the vendors in the street markets yell to sell their merchandise. So here I was trying to make a sort of like a street market setting with the addition of these body pillows that were also done with secondhand jeans. And then obviously there's a bunch of different layers to these works, which is the idea of immigration and formal, informal economies, but also sort of the layering of messages that we see in the t-shirts and what they represent. So I'm seeing them a little bit like contemporary portraits of our society. And obviously they were interactive, and kids and adults could poke their heads through. And I did a similar thing in Mexico City, but with integrated speakers, and the t-shirts you're seeing now were all donated by the public. And the idea was to pay homage to a specific street market in Mexico called El Chopo, which started, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that they were the main promoters of alternative culture in the 1980s in Mexico. And so the idea was to pay homage to this culture. The street market is still very much alive. And I did an edition of the t-shirts you're seeing now in exchange for the t-shirts that you saw previously in the work. This is the Queen's Museum show that Rob mentioned that was recently on view. It was very interactive, and we put a big carpet in the center so people could roll around and play in it. And the Guggenheim work, here you can see my group of seamstresses, which is a family of women. The woman with the gray hair is Vicky, my top seamstress and collaborator. We worked for the past, I don't know, maybe 8 years, and she's totally fundamental and important in the making of my work. So we usually go back and forth with ideas. Here you see the sort of revealing of that work, while, as Rob said, there was a choir of about 40 kids that were singing Nina Simone's version of Here Comes the Sun while the piece was being unveiled. And then now this gets me into the curtain that's currently at the Clark, which was done at the time when I was doing night cabarets in my studio in Mexico City, which used to be an old restaurant bar when in the 20s, where a very important queer poet called Salvador Novo used to frequent. So in that same spirit, we started doing drag cabaret performances with collaborations of local artist friends and poets, that we would have a different stage each time and different performers. And it was very much in the spirit of generating alternative spaces where different people from different walks of life could collaborate and just have fun and experiment with different ideas. So the piece at the Clark is, this is a picture I really like. We had pole dancer performances in the studio. And then finally, the one of my most recent works, which is in the Clark, and it's done with pantyhoses. And pantyhoses, when they turned stockings into pantyhoses. They were first used by the show business. So this interesting link of pantyhoses with performance is something that interested me, and the performance of the curtain itself as an object for veiling and revealing things, which is fundamental to performance, is something that interested me. And also, it's as Rob said, it's this little surprise that we see behind the curtain, which is a work that I chose from the Clark collection, which is a scene of a woman that is stitching by Baldini. And what interested me about that work is that it's a total construction of the domestic. So we're not seeing a portrait of a real mother with a son playing in the floor, but it was the lover of the painter. And they were, constructing this idea of femininity and domesticity, because it was a theme that was on high on demand at the time. And so that really interested me. And obviously it's, there's a very sort of tactile, almost sexual thing to the curtain, with the addition of these sort of perforations, which are really just the crotch area of the pantyhose that's sort of sewn up into sort of a vaginal type orifice. And then I included a couple of patterns, like the one you see at the top, of how I assemble these works. So basically it's just sort of almost a random layout of how we're gonna eventually stitch them up. And then the picture on the bottom left corner is Vicky, my top seamstress. She's standing on the top of her bed and showing us a fragment of the work. So we work a lot like this, in a very, very intimate setting, as you can see, where I go to her house. She usually sews from her room, and we talk a lot into how we can, make the piece, how it's built, how we can perfect it. So it's really this dialogue that happens between her and me, and sometimes her nieces or granddaughters that are involved in the production of the work. And lastly, I want to share a video of Beaky working. I think it's a very nice video, which gives you a sense of sort of the intricate and delicate work that went into the making of this curtain. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and switch to the video.
Lentamente aquí, así, despacito para no jalarla, porque si se jala, adiós pantimedia, adiós pantimedia.
There it is.
All right, thank you very much, Pia, and thank you everyone for joining us. We are very excited to have this conversation. And Pia, you raised so many interesting points in your presentation. And one thing that I wanted to pick up on is actually in your telling of the story of the cabaret and where it took place. And I think this brings up a line that I would like to thread throughout all of your work, and that is this, that the cabaret was taking place in a very historically important place in terms of providing an alternate narrative to the for lack of a better term, macho modernism that we know, for example, in Mexico. And I think throughout all of your work, we can trace this critique, as you said, of modernism. And I've heard you say in other points, for example, of the failure of modernism, right? And I'm wondering if you can talk more about your use of certain materials, right? And I think, for example, for me, it's very interesting that there's the commonality of pliable materials in your work, and I'm wondering if you think of it as a critique of modernism itself, that use of that very material, in addition to the fact that a lot of the material that you use is the byproduct of consumerism, right? Which in itself is a critique of the industrialization that goes along with the project of modernism, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, so the coincidence of having occupied the studio of this what used to be this restaurant bar where the queer poets used to go was remarkable, because when I first entered, it was just a warehouse, and a friend offered it to me, and I decided to take it. And as I started occupying the space, I realized that it was filled with history, and we intuitively decided, me and my friend PJ, who's an American photographer who's based in Mexico City, we decided to do these cabarets, and we as it was after a couple of those cabarets that we realized, as people kept coming to us from the public and saying, did you know that this was a restaurant bar? Or did you know, an expert on Salvador Novo said, I think this is the restaurant that he used to go to with the Los Anales, which is the nickname for that group of poets that was coined by Diego Rivera as a sort of criticism of what was outside the norm. And so they gathered in this space, and I always thought it was their spirit that was sort of like guiding us through doing those particular nights. And I think definitely the work does have in a more conscious fashion, so not in contrast to sort of how serendipitous the cabarets were. It definitely has this sort of a connecting thread of me revisiting modernism, first because obviously it interests me, and formally I was always attracted to abstract art, but in places like Mexico, and living Mexico through a woman's perspective, it became more and more evident how those ideologies were just sort of doomed to failure. The reality of Mexico is a lot more brutal, and there's intense contrasts, economic, social, and you see lots of sort of gaps where these ideologies just sort of failed. And for me, these symbols of the abandoned billboard or the abandoned house were starting to sort of carry those significations for me. And so it was a way to sort of enter it. And other entry points for me are also, contemporary or the art history itself, using modernist artists like Ligia Pape, who's a woman, and I totally admire, but trying to reevaluate those concepts in a contemporary setting. And so, for example, Ligia's work, which is incredibly important, it was done as a sign of protest of the dictatorship in Brazil in the 60s. And by me sort of doing a remake of it, which the title of the work I did is Divisor Pirata, so it's the pirate version of Ligia's work, is interesting because I don't think a white sheet is sufficient to talk about the complexities of our current society. And so this is why I used, pirated goods. And so I think it's, I just sort of go back and forth between sort of paying homage to, certain things that I definitely respect and have learned from through modernism and its even its ideologies or art making of that time, but trying to always sort of bring in a more contemporary look into it and a more personal look as I said, as a woman artist making work now in Mexico City, and with regards to the material, fabric is, I trained as a painter for many years, and then I switched into fabric when I had an art band in 2009, I think. And we were sewing our costumes and making our stage sets. And I should have included a photo of that in the work, but it should be on my webpage if you're interested. It was called El Resplandor, and it was a very performative band and very experimental. And it's the first time I started working with fabric, and I realized that it sort of embodied everything that interested me. The idea of performance, of the corporal, of being sort of its relation to by corporal I mean its relation to the body and how the body interacts with space and people, and it's the work, as you see, has gotten increasingly performative, and I think fabric has allowed to sort of permeate all these sort of multiple aspects that I'm interested in. So it's become literally a very flexible, malleable material to work with.
Yeah, and I really like your usage of the word revisit instead of just pure critique, because I think there is a lot of potential in that word, in thinking through, the perhaps what you would like to rescue, and then what you would like to contribute to or add on to from a contemporary perspective. You also bring up in your reference to Ligia Pape, and I know also you reference, for example, the work of Elior Tisica. I could also see certain references perhaps to another Brazilian artist, Marta Araújo, but I also even think of the Venezuelan artist Gego. And I think all of these share either a feminist or a queer critique of certain modernist tendencies, and the way that I see them comparing and paralleling your work is that they're also using these pliable and intimate materials that necessarily insist on the body in some way. And this brings me, I guess, to the question of legibility that I'm really curious about in terms of how you've seen your work being read in terms of its references depending on where you are. And I'm also thinking of the fact that you grew up in Mexico City, but you've gone to RISD and you also trained in London. So I'm wondering how these types of references play in the larger picture in terms of this revisiting of modernism, but then also in terms of the geopolitics of references, right? That now more and more people are recognizing someone like Ligia Pape from the United States, for example, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I think with going back to the idea of legibility, I think when I start making work, it's usually more of an intuitive reaction of what I'm seeing and trying to sort of interpret it in my own weird way. But with time and after you do a couple of projects, I do see a sort of a commonality of the way I start building these works. And I think what struck me was the idea that things didn't necessarily have to be spoken through this sort of linear, logical perspective, which I think, again, if you see it from a feminist perspective, it's entirely patriarchal, right? That, it's the artist that has sort of this, a very sort of logical way of addressing knowledge, information, however you want to say it. And the idea that there's a multiplicity of voices or ways to sort of understand the work became a lot more important for me. And so purposefully, and I've been doing it more and more, is that the work needs to have a lot of access points. That it shouldn't just speak about, this overarching sort of idea that, I hold the truth and I'm going to sort of tell you, like you said, this is a work that critiques modernism with that level of authority, but more, it's more a dialogue, it's a revisit, it's even a space for, for play. It could be a playful work if you make it interactive. And that in play, there's a lot of things that can be exchanged. And so this is why the work, it could, like the Queen's Museum piece that you saw, it was talked a lot in terms of like, this is a very fun work, but the underarching themes are quite strong, it's a red carpet and you're talking about, immigration issues, and we're obviously involving the Latin community in Queens. And so what I see is more and more these platforms for showing the work become potential sort of places for dialogue with the institution, with the community, with the public that goes to see it, and then, try to do as much back and forth exchange with the works. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's more or less how I like to see my approach to the art making.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, the multiplicity of voices. And there's, I think part of that, at least in my experience of your work, is that there is a certain seduction in terms of the sensual quality of the works themselves. And then once you approach them, perhaps because they are, either large scale or this very rich color or this material that you really want to touch, or you were actually invited to touch and interact with, then you start, pun intended, unveiling certain meanings, right, that have to do with very serious concerns. But I think there's something really interesting about using perhaps playfulness, and that doesn't cancel out the concerns of the work.
Yeah, certainly. I think it has to do with a mix of my training as a painter, which, I went into painting because I enjoy drawing very much, but also I just enjoy color, textures. I live in a city that, when you come out, you're bombarded with color. And so I've always used it very sort of freely and intuitively. And so the work does have interest for the formal in that sense, because it's sort of part of my how I was formed. But the idea of play is something I discovered with my own kids. I'm a mother of two, and I've worked in the house in very kind of chaotic contexts where you start seeing that there's a lot of things happening there. That art I've always escaped this idea of art being sort of a very sort of hygienic, highly controlled space where everything's on a pedestal and you can't touch it, and there's even a sort of behavior that needs to go about how you experience work. I think unfortunately a lot of art experiencing gets lost in that. And I think what I like about the Brazilian artists that you mentioned is that they were saying, let's bring participation back into it, and Lydia and other female Brazilian artists were doing it as art through therapeutic means, and using art as a therapeutical sort of tool. And Elio was doing it as a way to sort of engage with the favelas, or the sort of the low class of Brazil. And I think for me, it was my kids that brought in this sense of play, and I sort of pondered on that and how I can start getting publics to sort of experience it through the same lens. and not see play as something that's sort of undermined or seen less important in this more or less sort of conceptual frame, but something that's actually critical in how we experience the world and how we, get information,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's even a sense of play, or at least for me, because I find a particular joy and humor in seeing, for example, pantyhose in the lobby of the Clark Art Institute. But in all seriousness, actually, I am wondering if you can talk about that piece a little bit more, because to me it presents a little bit of a departure in terms of the use of color, right? That it is, even though your work always is insisting on the body, this to me is the one that really insinuates the body much more explicitly, and even with the kind of erotic connotations of the pantyhose itself. So could you talk a little bit more about why you decided to go with that type of material, and if the site at all informed why you went in that direction?
Yeah, I think in several conversations with Rob, we kept coming back and forth from the putting color or not putting color on the curtain. In terms of why I chose pantyhoses, I wanted a transparent material that allowed you to sort of play with that niche in the window in such a way that, it blocked it, but not entirely, and you could still see through from the lobby into the library or vice versa. And then what generated is a very sort of intimate little niche there that was sort of designed as a place for reflection if you wanted to just go there and sit in the ledge of the window and use it as a bench, which I wasn't sure if it's the use that they give it, but there's potential of trying to literally make spaces in the in-between areas or the transition areas from the private to the public, or the more intimate to the more, social. And sort of, I just really literally saw that wall or that space as a transitionary, sort of porous space that, I think pantyhoses sort of had that ability to capture that. And then I did try to make a few prototypes with color pantyhoses, and I wasn't liking it. It seemed a little too arbitrary, the colors I was using. And then when I went to nudes, there was an idea there that I wanted to keep sort of emphasizing, which was the idea, obviously, of skin color and how that related to race or gender issues. And I have done curtains in the past where I have tried the Fade into Black curtain, for example, which was done for a space in Savannah, in the Museum of Art and Design, which used to be a train station that was built by the slaves in Georgia. And sort of we integrated a lot of Black Lives Matter t-shirts there, and it brought the idea of sort of the history of the cotton commerce that was exchanged there, and etc. I think this gets back into this idea of how do these multiple histories or interests start being layered into the work, depending on sort of the origin of the material, what it's expressing. And so in this sense, I went to a downtown store in Mexico City, and I decided I was going to use one type or brand of pantyhose because they had to be the same size and quality in order for me to build this sort of more homogeneous textile. And so what I discovered is there were really just 5 shades of skin tones. And so that already starts telling you of, how race is sort of discreetly sort of, or indiscreetly, but so it starts sort of being weaved into sort of popular culture and commerce, and what gets prioritized or what not. It speaks about certain racial sort of prejudices, and I'm not trying to use these works to necessarily offer any response, but just sort of more like expose and try to touch up on ideas that allow the viewer to start thinking of these issues. And in terms of its relation to the feminine, I think there's also something I've explored a lot, as you saw in the work that I showed, is sort of the idea of sort of how the image of the feminine is constructed in commerce. And I think in this particular work, both race and gender have a nice sort of dialogue happening there. But that's sort of more or less the stuff that's on my head while I'm making these works.
Yeah, the codification of race and certainly of femininity are very present in that work. And just to just keeping an eye on the time, but I wanted to make sure that also we address the other pieces that are in the exhibition, because I do think it's interesting that the skins in this iteration of their presentation, instead of being worn, right, they're very much assuming this monumental presence, right, of the references that you are alluding to in the work. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about your decision to place them in that certain way versus wearing them, and how you think of the works in depending on the venue, or if it's just kind of this evolving way that you see your work, that in certain contexts they should be worn or installed on the wall.
Yeah, I think it's more what you said at the end, that the purpose for working with fabric and doing this type of work, it should entail definitely that disposition to be flexible and understand sort of that different contexts inform the work in different ways. And as I said, I think as an artist, it's been very enriching to try to see those opportunities as potential dialogues with institutions, to understand how they operate, how they work, how the public moves around the space. In that particular space, it's a highly used public space, and so Rob and I made that decision to sort of hang them on the walls as you see them. Obviously, the tunic, strangely, is not made to be worn because it doesn't have a head or a face. It's just sort of the implication of sort of the archetype of what a tunic is, which is, it could be, in not just the Mexican traditional wear, but also, we've seen it in, African, traditional dress, or we've seen, it's a very sort of like archetypical shape, this T-shaped tunic. So it's just an echo of that, but it's never been worn. I think because it's fabric, it's made like a real tunic, except that it doesn't have a head. So that's always been shown on a wall. The cloak for three, that's also on view, is meant to be, it's a Stella remake, which I added the title Cloak for Three, hoping that one day I'm going to make a performance where three people are going to be in a space wearing it, and sort of the negotiation that happens with these people wearing it, it's sort of what the performance is about. But that hasn't happened, and we decided to show it almost like a painting. And so it's also a reading that interests me, trying to do same to doing remakes of Lydia's work. I like the idea of doing exact replicas of Stella's work in fabric. Now, something that hasn't been said about those works is that the fabric was picked from places in Mexico City, or vendors that resale the fabric that is not that is discarded from the industrial process of when the fabric is being printed. And if the machine runs out of fabric, or if they're sort of calibrating the machine at the beginning, you usually get this like ink sweeps that are very expressionistic, but they're errors, and they're done by a machine. So for me, it's interesting to work with these ideas of doing a Stella remake with discarded fabric that looks expressionistic, which is something that Stella abhorred, you know, but the fact that it's made by a machine, which goes back into sort of the ideas of, you know, that Stella, I think, was trying to tackle at the time. So it's just trying to put things on its head a little bit and being a little bit more playful with those meanings, and allowing sort of these remakes to sort of go in and out in a very free, playful way between those significations. Or so
yeah, sorry, go on.
No. I think that's about it.
No. I just wanted to follow on what you said, because this question of sort of negotiating with the institution and the way that things are displayed. I mean, it's clear that so much of that work is about desacralizing, is about taking high art off of its pedestal, bringing it down into the everyday. From the institutional side, I'm self-aware in knowing that like we've monumentalized them. We've done all but say like, please don't touch. I mean, we haven't done that. We haven't put stanchions. But I wanted to ask you about those negotiations, because I think what's so exciting about your work is that you're making beautiful objects, but you're activating them with performance. You're engaging with the communities in which you work. You are engaging with informal economies, which I think is hugely interesting. And it kind of, not all of those factors are present in our show for various reasons, but I just wanted to ask about the question of economies in particular. Just, you know, you're using informal economies. The economy of the museum as an institution is, I would say, highly formalized. I mean, when your work arrives, even though I saw it being produced in Mexico City and saw the ways that it was being moved and handled, and it's simultaneously very fragile and very resilient. Anyway, we treat it like an absolute masterpiece. And then the art market has its own economies, which are in some ways formal, in other ways quite informal. How do you navigate those? And do you enjoy sort of, in some ways, thwarting them? Or I mean, how does that work for you?
Yeah, I think I try to, as long as the heart of the work is not negotiated. So some of it's important issues or things that I find important of trying to communicate. I think the rest is a negotiation where there's always pockets of trying to sort of destabilize those economies. And so, for example, the pantyhose curtain that's touching the floor, it's an issue that, you know, it seems like a very simple gesture, but I think that's something we talked a lot about, Rob, is like, should it be a few inches above the ground so that when they sweep, it doesn't get, and I think that was a place where I try to just stand my ground and say, I really want the curtain to be touching. And this is, since I've been doing curtains, it really just comes down to that. It's like, if the curtain can touch the floor, then it's a win battle for me, because it really gets into this idea of conservation and art handling, and it's sort of a very, the act that it's touching the ground, it's sort of subverting that in a very sort of a sort of simple way. But I've also learned that trying to keep an eye on not so much the sort of the politics, but more the idea of conservation, art conservation, which is something that no matter how subversive I want to be, I have to sort of keep an eye on that as well, because I want my work to be handled for the posterity. Because it's not because it's important, but because I think it's worth sort of having it be around, in a sense that it's discussing issues that are outside my very own personal interests, and getting into what the experience is like for a woman in Mexico to be, art making in the specific time we're living in, how these issues of gender and, immigration are, directly affecting me as, and that it should talk about that these works hopefully are touching on those larger issues, and that, if I want this work to be around, where we need to pay attention to those things, and the work needs to be conserved properly, and it needs to be handled properly. And so I think there's a win and gain for both sides, and the dialogue and the negotiation that happens is very valuable, I think, not just for you, but for the artist as well.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful way of thinking about it, of not in terms of absolutes, but in terms of that dialogue or dialectic or back and forth. And I remember talking about the length of the curtain and thinking, okay, so yeah, this is site specific. It can only ever exist in this place. Should it just touch the floor? Or is that, that would fit, but is that actually, is that too clean and modernist? And you were, of course, right, because at the end of the day, of course, like, I learned a term, puddling, that like the way a curtain hangs on the floor.
Yeah.
So, arguing for this kind of Baroque puddling was spot on. And it so affects the space. It affects the way we move in the space. It affects the way we handle the space and treat it infrastructurally. But it's entirely transforms that space. So, and okay, so I wanted to open it up for questions. I see one question. Hi, Izzy. I see a question from Izzy about how you think, Pia, about, given these sort of critiques of or engagements with modernism, how you've responded to some of the buildings you've worked in, which are, Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim is an absolute assertion of architectural, sort of imperatives and authorship. It's very forceful. How you think about that, or the Clark's Manton building, or just how you respond. You're now at the Museo Tamayo, which is an extraordinary sort of set of spaces. It's clear that this is on your mind, but just how you think about the buildings in which you exhibit.
A lot. I think it's super fundamental in sort of the first thing I noticed when I'm going to make a work or I get a commission for a specific work is the space. So each work is a direct response to the space, and sometimes formally, or sometimes in terms of its use and its sort of the more sort of symbolic sort of references, like I mentioned, the transition of the public and private in the Manton, or as you mentioned in the Guggenheim, sort of trying to what I did, because the piece was part of the 100-year celebration of the building. So that particular year they were doing a bunch of events related to the building's anniversary. And so there I wanted to sort of remind people that this notion of the Frank Lloyd Wright's interest in this, generating this sort of like more spiritual type of experience with art making, and the importance of sun as a fundamental sort of element in the building, and how that affected the experience of the building and the art that was shown there. But I took it yes, in a formal way, but also symbolic, in a sense of using for that specific work the idea of the sun as a positive message that would shine a light to immigration issues that were being discussed between US and Mexico, and the experience of the immigrant communities everywhere in the US, but for that specific show was the communities in Queens and Harlem, and most of these communities hadn't even been to the museum because of where it's located. And so a lot of the dialogue that happened with the institution was, how do we diversify our public? Because these are issues that for the past 100 years the institution hasn't addressed. how can we, it's in the Upper East, and it's, you know, a very specific crowd that goes to see this building. And, you know, the fact that so how that show worked, and I'll just say it really quickly, is that we offered free passes and a Metro card for in the exchange of a t-shirt that was then used to make the work. And so we had a very large show up of more than, you know, 150, 200 people commuting from different places of New York, going to see the show, participating, and then sharing their experience with us, and, you know, telling us, you know, I've never been to this part of New York, you know, it's great to be here. And then now the museum is obviously thinking of how they can have people, Spanish speakers, to do tours in the museum. And so I think these are things that are fundamental to, you know, how we reestablish institutions from these other perspectives. And so I'm sort of deviating away from the question, but not really, because I think that when I say that the work is site specific, it's all these different angles that I'm trying to tackle, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much, but, you know, that they should be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, I've never seen the Guggenheim so full of life and energy, and all the way up the spiral, people so engaged in this sort of collective exuberance that it was quite moving. I wanted to ask, as we near the end, just kind of what you're working on now and what you're thinking about, and yeah, what's next?
It's a big change for me, but I think I would say it's the same for everyone, that this pandemic has sort of thrown us into a total different mind space and reevaluate and reprioritize our lives. And so for me, it sort of came down to deciding that I wanted to move out of the city for the first time. I lived in abroad, but I've always been based in Mexico City. So for the first time, I moved with my family to the country, and I'm currently building a studio space in the middle of a forest. And it happens that the house we're renting, the owner there allowed me to do this small construction there. And so what it comes down to me now is sort of trying to assess, you know, what I consider valuable now in terms of, you know, trying to decentralize from the big cities and having a more intimate, direct connection with nature, and offering other possibilities for my kids, reprioritizing things that I thought were important, like keeping them in urban schools where they had a certain type of, you know, education, and understanding that, you know, it's really up to us to make it better for them, that maybe academics can be understood through different perspectives, that offering them that connection to nature makes us more empathetic and more aware that we need to start acting fast in order to reverse our, you know, pretty sort of dark diagnosis of where the planet is heading. And so it's really just really became sort of a very sort of decisive thing to do, and took 2 weeks to make the cut and start looking to other possibilities in this very quite difficult situation that we're all facing, and seeing how can we pitch in, you know, how can we do something about it. So there's definitely a very sort of conscious act on my side to make the best of what's happening now, and that seemed like the way I wanted to go. Now, the type of art making I'm gonna do will be directly affected by my context, as it's always been. And so I'm doing a lot of walks in nature now, and it's a very, very rural area with cows and horses and chickens and roosters, and I've never had that before. So it's really been a very intuitive, slow, sort of very sort of also trying to feel my way through it in a more intuitive way, as opposed to logically and intellectually. And just, I hope that eventually shows in the process of my art making.
Absolutely. We have one more question. This comes from Mariana Fernandez, who worked on this exhibition, who you know. She's asking how your engagement with the land relates to some of your artwork that has recently been outdoor, and how if this is a kind of a new chapter, or considering how much of your space has been urban and interior, how you're thinking about engagements with the landscape and earthworks or other kinds of artwork of that kind.
Yeah, hi Mariana. The idea about the land is, I think, with the big public work I did of the Lover's Rainbow, which is a huge rainbow done with rebar, and we did two versions of it in different sides of the border, one in Ensenada, close to the Tijuana border, and one in Coachella Valley in California. And they were meant to be a couple, or a lovers couple, that was sort of talking to each other. And obviously the rainbow being a symbol for fertility and also diversity, and that these were issues that were important to be addressed in relation to the immigration politics that were happening at the time, which is when the caravan was crossing or trying to cross the border into the US, and they were faced with a lot of aggression due to Trump's intolerance with the immigrants. And so that's the first time I started really thinking about land in this more sort of symbolic, well, not so symbolic, because I was like literally digging into the ground to build this sort of monumental works, but sort of started understanding that there's a let's see if I can say this in a way that makes sense, but that part of the sort of the feminist undertaking in as an artist, I think, should address issues of land, because land is, I think, inherently a feminine force that needs to be nurtured and cared for. And so I think from one side of the balance, there's these ideas that are more sort of like social constructs of our politics and community and gender issues. But then there's this other very important force that it's, as I said, much more intuitive. It speaks about, related ideas about sustainability and what sustains us as humans, and what's definitely sort of the life that is sort of the connecting life that speaks to everyone, because it's just sort of like this vital connecting thread that's our relation as humans to the land, and it's been totally not cared or not nurtured, and we've sort of separated ourselves entirely. And I think the pandemic is a natural byproduct of that, and that we now have to start seeing how we sort of become much more respectful and for the land, and how we can lead more sustainable lives, hopefully, and have a much better balance with our environment. And I think these are issues that I rarely had spoken about in my work, and which concern me a lot more now. And it will definitely, I think, be something that I start talking about in the work more and more, because I consider it very important.
Thank you, Pia. That's a beautiful, expansive, urgent note to end on. I want to thank you. I want to thank Mari for joining us in this conversation. I want to thank everyone for attending today. The show is on until January 3rd. It's a pleasure to see you, Pia. Pleasure to see you, Mari. And thank you so much for coming.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Gracias, Mari, and thank you, Robert and the Clark.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.